I'm extremely pleased to announce that Daily Wire Plus has decided to make the 16-part Exodus seminar fully and freely available to everyone over the next 4 months on YouTube. We are, therefore, truly beyond pleased to invite you all most hospitably to partake in this great moral banquet. Hello everyone, watching and listening. We're here for episode 17, an hour long, the finale of the Exodus seminar. And we're going to reflect on the entire voyage and discuss Exodus, the way forward. And so I'll summarize where we've been and the story as a whole. So the story it's an existential tale, I would say, of the dynamic between too much order and too much chaos. That's a way of thinking about it, an exploration of proper governance. And the story begins with the Israelites in captivity as slaves to a tyrant. And I would say to some degree, insofar as we've fallen out of favor or concordance with our tradition, we're all the slavish children of tyrants. Sometimes that's the external tyrant, sometimes that's our own tyrant. And so the story is true psychologically and sociologically at the same time, and that gives it kind of an eternal truth. So the Israelites are laboring under the yoke of the Egyptians, and a leader arises, Moses, who's called by God to chastise the tyrant, implying that there is a divine spirit of sovereign power in whose nature is the proclivity to punish the tyrant, and also a call to the Israelites to free themselves from the yoke of the tyrant. And so God is portrayed as the spirit that inspires the enslaved, the unjustly enslaved, to free themselves. And so Moses is their unwilling leader, not a gifted man verbally, but nonetheless touched by God to have this inspiring capacity. And he is enjoined by God to stand up against the tyrant and to tell him, the Pharaoh, that unless his people are let go, all hell is going to break loose, which it does in the form of a multitude of plagues, which we analyzed in some detail, plagues that destroy both the present of the Egyptians and their future in the last plague, the death of the firstborn. The Israelites are then sent out into the desert by the Egyptians, who are finally terrified by the God their sorcery cannot duplicate. And in a last-ditch attempt to establish their tyrannical sovereignty, they decide to kill the Israelites and end up drowned in the Red Sea. And then the Israelites have escaped from the tyrant. And this is where the story, I think, becomes even more realistic. It's so profoundly and remarkably and surprisingly realistic, because it's easy for naive people to think that once you've escaped from the tyrant, you're scot-free. And the scot-freedom is you can do whatever you want, whenever you want. But it turns out that's the desert. And so Exodus story juxtaposes two extremes at the top and the bottom of human life, you might say. And one is an extreme of order, and that's tyranny, but the other is an extreme of chaos, and that's this desert-like freedom where, sure, you're free, but where are you going, and which way is up, and can you do anything at all? And you're lost, and the Israelites are lost in the desert, and it's not pleasant, and it's not even obvious that it's better than the tyranny. And so they get all whiny and squawky and complain, and they're miserable and lost, and then they fall prey to the temptation to elevate Moses to the role of Pharaoh, and he almost falls prey to the temptation to become that. He sits as their judge, and his father-in-law Jethro shows up and says, look, you can't do this, Moses. You're going to wear yourself to a frazzle judging this fractious people from dawn till night, and you're in danger of becoming a tyrant yourself. Plus your people, granted they're completely useless, but unless you give them some responsibility, they're going to stay that way. So Jethro introduces the principle of what comes to be known as history progresses as subsidiarity. And it's so cool, and I didn't really understand this about the text, is that not only does the text interrogate the nature of tyranny and its proclivity to double down, and the nature of slavery and the probability that that will be accompanied by a kind of craven, resentful, cowardly murmuring and bitterness, but it also lays out the archetype of ordered freedom as the antithesis to the tyrant and to the chaos of the desert. And the ordered freedom is like a hierarchy of intermediation between that which is in the highest place and the people themselves. And it involves the construction of a hierarchical structure of responsibility. And that's the true antithesis to the tyrant. And it's the solution to the problem of the Tower of Babel. And it's the solution to the problem of how to make the infinite manifest in the finite without having the infinite wreak havoc on the finite. And I didn't know that really before we walked through this seminar. And it's so illuminating to understand that that's the basis of the idea of good governance, both conceptually and practically. So that's ridiculously interesting and cool. And so the principle of subsidiary is established. Moses gets the laws. They're a little too intense, and the Israelites immediately fall prey to their fractiousness and start to worship idols. And that means they lose faith in the spirit that has guided them out of tyranny and into the desert. And the covenant is then, the tablets are broken, the covenant is reestablished with a bit less divine force, you might say, although it's also prolonged. And then they fall prey to all the temptations of an established state. They become lustful, and what that means in this situation is, well, they're kind of secure, and they got their subsidiary structures in place, but now they cultivate their own longings, and they invent privations, and they transform themselves into pathetic victims, even though they have absolutely no reason to do so, and that shakes the state to its foundation. And they move forward still to the degree that they can, motivated by the vision of the promised land, but that falls apart too, and they become faithless. And so God nonetheless keeps his covenant with them. This is something I found particularly interesting about the text too, and I didn't understand this exactly. So, you know, modern people they'll dismiss the idea of a covenantal relationship, the idea that you actually have a personal relationship with God. That's just obviously the most primitive of superstitions. But you know what's so interesting about this text is that it insists, psychologically speaking, that the proper polity is to be modeled after the idea of a relationship, and a relationship of sacrifice and bargaining, and that if you organize yourself properly psychologically and socially, it's as if you're developing a relationship. That's the right metaphor. It's relationship. It's not contractual subjugation. It's not abiding by a set of rules or even a set of principles. They're there, but they're echoes of the covenantal relationship. And the proper relationship is put forth as something like, well, the possibility of communicating with the infinite in a personal manner, predicated on the assumption that you're in something like a father-son relationship, and that's the most appropriate way to conduct yourself if you're going to thrive, if your family is going to thrive, and if your state is going to survive and wax more abundant. And you know, it seems to me that that's, not only is that right, but I think in some ways it's necessarily right, because biologically speaking, you are a personality, and the personality exists in relationship, and you wouldn't have evolved into a personality if the personality in relationship wasn't the proper mode of being in the world. And so not only does it seem right, it seems inevitable, but it's still very surprising that the right metaphor is covenantal relationship. And then this absurdly optimistic assumption that not only is this a covenantal relationship that's personal with something that's best characterized as a spirit, even with human qualities, but that's the necessary foundation for a state that's neither tyranny nor chaos. I mean, that's something. That's an utterly revolutionary idea. And I think its revolutionary force also struck me walking through this Exodus seminar, because I kind of knew that, but not as explicitly as has been revealed to me as a consequence of this journeying. So that was really something. And the story closes with the death of Moses. He never gets to the promised land, and perhaps none of us do, no matter how remarkably we comport ourselves in this life, and that seems realistic. And the story, as it nears its end, also insists upon the necessity of confronting that which terrifies you and poisons you the most voluntarily, and that's a mode of redemption. It ends with the statement by God that there are rewards for following the covenant and punishments for not doing so, and the rewards are major and the punishments are dire, but that even if you deviate, there's the possibility of return to the relationship, which I think that's about as hopeful a statement as you could possibly hope for. And we get a good lesson about what constitutes proper leadership out of the story as well. Moses is not a tyrant. He's not self-aggrandizing. He has a proclivity towards narcissism from time to time, but he keeps it damn well under control, and he's always attempting to subordinate himself vertically to God and staying in communication with his people, difficult as that is. And so he's a great model for true leadership, and he's also the person who introduces and is open to and abides by the principle of subsidiarity. So he's not gathering all the power unto himself, even though that's a temptation from time to time. I think that's brutally realistic and flies in the face of any sort of accusation on the part of, let's say, rationalist atheists that there's nothing to these stories but like a superstitious, what would you say, defense against death anxiety and a post hoc justification for the nature of God. It's like, no, this is pretty brutal and it's pretty realistic. And so it's been extraordinarily fun, and I've learned a tremendous amount, and it's been a privilege and an honor to be part of this. That's for sure. And so, so now we'll find out. We're going to go around the table one by one, and we're going to let everybody reflect on the story and what they've learned, and take the opportunity to say anything they want to say. And James, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you, Jordan, and thank you, everyone. I mean, looking back on these 16 episodes, it's impossible to distill everything. I've learned so much, but I think more than that, I've been moved so much. At almost every episode, there's been some moment that has not just sort of illuminated me cognitively, intellectually, but has moved me deeply. And I'm just thinking about the enormous popularity that of the first series, and I wonder, why is that? And I'm just thinking, if this had been a more kind of formal university seminar or a seminar in a seminary, we'd have been looking at the sorts of questions and themes and problems that we just haven't touched on at all. Like, there's a whole guild of scholarship that approaches these texts in a completely different way. Questions of historicity. Like, did this happen? How did it happen? When did it happen? Is it plausible that it happened? Questions of authorship, the sort of different layers, the different editorial hands that are at work in the different texts. And all of that it's legitimate scholarship, of course. It's a legitimate avenue of human inquiry. But it's not been our approach. I mean, that approach, I was thinking about this earlier today, that approach tends to generate a kind of a mosaic that doesn't produce a very clear picture. Lots of little different editors, lots of different authors, lots of different schools of interpretation. We've been approaching it as mosaic, capital M, in the sense that we've been approaching it as we've kind of bracketed those questions. We haven't said that it's a false way of doing things, or it's a true way of doing things, but we've kind of done an end run around all of that. We've treated it as mosaic. We've treated it, in other words, as a single, unified vision that stresses story and symbol, and also the third S, the sacred. I mean, this is what's been most interesting and moving for me. We've all got our different confessional commitments. Some of us may not have any confessional commitments at all, but we've approached this text with reverence, and we've been treating it really just very seriously, and we've been open to mining its riches. And I think that is just so important, and accounts for the success of the conversations. And
maybe to revere a text is to allow it to open itself up to you. I mean, that might be exactly the issue.
I think so. So we've seen, just on the story side, I mean, it's just that the narrative logic's been brought alive for me by, Greg has been great on the storytelling side, and Jonathan too, and the symbolism, you've brought that out, and Jonathan has too, but also, as I said, we've all got our different commitments, and we've been understanding it through our different faith traditions, as it were.
Yeah, nobody ever asked the question in the seminar, why are we taking this text seriously, right? That was an a priori commitment, and it's interesting that was the case and that it never came up as an issue, right?
We've come back again and again. I think this is what I found so moving, that it's not been that we've been reading Exodus, but that Exodus has been reading us. Mm-hmm. We've learned new things about ourselves. We've learned new things about society. It's generally not been a very political discussion either, and yet we've seen the enormous kind of political ramifications, the new ways we can understand the problems of affecting society and culture through this ancient text. It's just been remarkable for that reason. So those have been the things I've taken away. I mean, the text itself. What is there more to say? I mean, I work in philosophy. I spent a lot of time reading the ancient Greeks, reading contemporary philosophy. It's really, you might say that the world of Plato and Aristotle is sort of the world of the timeless and of the abstract, the world of logic. And we have had some of this. So famously, in Exodus 3:14, there is this sense that God is, as it were, beyond time. Is like, as in Plato, he sort of occupies that heaven beyond the cave. And yet, it's not just that. It's a God who comes down into the cave, who is moved, who shows his compassion, who breaks into history. I think we tend to have this very bifurcated way of thinking about history. I mean, either as random in some sense, or perhaps as determined in the Marxist sense, or as always heading in a particular kind of progressive direction, or we sort of have the kind of timeless logical approach of the sort of the rationalists. And what we see here in these texts is a fusion of those two traditions. We see it's got both. We can see, obviously, it's enormous contribution to the Christian intellectual tradition, but we see in it, as it were, glimpses of the Hellenic as well, glimpses of the Greek tradition. And that's been remarkable for me, this idea that for the first time here we see that the idea that history has a direction, but it's not a random direction, it's not fully determined, it takes seriously human freedom, it accommodates human failure, and it unfolds always not just in a kind of random dynamic flux, but against an objective, transcendent standard of the good, of moral order, of political order, and of social order.
Are you looking to dive deeper into the entire Bible? Look no further than the Hallow app, the #1 prayer app in the world, featuring an entire category of content to help you dive deeper into prayer and meditation on the Bible. By studying the Bible, you'll gain a deeper appreciation for the power of storytelling, symbolism, and metaphor, enriching your understanding of literature across different genres. Go through the Bible in a year with Father Mike Schmitz, or hear the Bible narrated by renowned actors like Jonathan Rumi from The Chosen or Jim Caviezel from Sound of Freedom. Hallow has over 10,000 audio-guided prayers, meditations, and music to deepen your understanding and knowledge of the Bible. The Hallow app also helps you connect with a community of like-minded individuals, sharing experiences, insights, and encouragement along your path to spiritual growth. Download the app for free at hallow.com/exodus. You can set reminders and track your progress along the way. Enrich your education and nurture your mind and soul today. Download the Hallow app at hallow.com/exodus. That's hallow.com/exodus. Again, it's hallow.com/exodus for an exclusive 3-month free trial of all 10,000 plus prayers and meditations.
With a tremendous insistence that at its basis, the fundamental order is both good and relational.
And personal, exactly.
Yeah, amazing. Dennis.
So I'll say a personal word and then a global word. So on the personal, to be self-revealing, I have this theory, and I hope I don't think I did say this at any of our sessions, but I've had this theory a long time. You know, there are many ways of dividing people, right? There are those who this, there are those who that. So one of my divisions is there are those who want to be stars, and there are those who want to be on an all-star team. And I am in the latter. I have never, my joy is to be on an all-star team. So that's what I have felt for all these seminars, all our sessions. And that's a great honor and a much greater joy than being a star. I mean, what I have learned from each of you is emotionally as well as intellectually rewarding. I intend to bring a lot of these ideas to the audience that I have through my radio and PragerU and my little synagogue in Los Angeles. So this is a big thank you to all of you. I don't have much to add. I just want to say one large thing that I thought of the entire time. I don't think that there's a secular equivalent to what we have done here. I don't think there can be a secular equivalent.
Why not?
Because secularism doesn't produce wisdom. That's why. I'm convinced of that, and I have proof. It's not a theory. The most secular institutions in our society have the least wisdom, the universities. So either what I'm saying is true or not true. But if it's true that the least wise institutions are the most secular, it is causative. It's not just correlated. They are, it is a factor. And the great line from the Bible, what is it? Again, I got to go from the Hebrew. Wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord. When I was at Columbia, and it's on the internet, I wrote this 25 years ago, how I found God at Columbia. So I was at the Graduate School of International Relations, or International Affairs. And I was already then learning nonsense. Men and women are basically the same. That was already taught to me in the 1970s. And America and Soviet Union, they're just both superpowers. This was not a battle of good and evil or freedom and tyranny. It was two superpowers. I remember the analogy given by my professor, two scorpions in a bottle. So I was learning nonsense, and it was driving me a little crazy. And I never, except once in my life, had an epiphany. I've never had a theophany. God has never appeared to me. I mean, he appears to me in the pages of the Torah, to be honest, but never appeared to me directly in any way. But I had an epiphany. All of a sudden, as I kept asking myself, why is there so much nonsense here from such intelligent people? That phrase, wisdom begins with the fear of God, came to me. I had last said it in second grade in my Jewish school. I had not said it since second grade. And it just came into my brain. And then I realized, oh, there's no wisdom here because there's no God here. I would now even refine it. There was no wisdom there because there was no Bible there. Because there are people who believe in God who are fools. But the Bible is a repository of wisdom. So when I said, I don't think there's a secular equivalent, and you said, what do you mean? That's what I mean. And I want the viewers and listeners to this to understand that. If you've been uplifted by this, tell me what secular equivalent has uplifted you like this has. That's my challenge to the people watching or listening to this. I have summarized my 40 years of broadcasting, and I've said it all 40 years. I have one overwhelming message: the deleterious consequences of secularism. And this has just reinforced that in
I
me.
think, you know, I talked to Douglas Murray about this with Jonathan at one point, and one of the things Murray has been brought to, I would say, kicking and screaming in some real sense, and I would put myself in the same category, is that it seems likely that the secular is inevitably grounded in a narrative. There's no way out of that. It's grounded in a narrative. Now, you can debate about what that narrative is and should be, but I don't think you can debate that it has to be grounded in a narrative. And a narrative is a narrative. If it's to be a narrative, it is a narrative of something approximating relationship. And so I think your argument is technically correct, is that the secular is groundless. And if the secularists claim detachment from a narrative, all that means is that either their narrative is fragmented or it's unconscious. So,
well, I'll just end with this. There's no way out. I mean, if you're intellectually honest and secular, life is pointless. End of issue. It is pointless. We don't believe life is pointless at this table. No. That's the point. Jewish, Orthodox, Christian, Catholic, Protestant, doesn't matter. We know there's a point. We don't know exactly what. I don't claim to, but I know that there is.
Do we know, or do we posit that in abiding faith and move forward courageously as a consequence?
Posit that in abiding faith and move forward as a consequence.
Okay, all right. Greg.
Well, thank you for gathering us. This has been an amazing experience for me. A lot of you, most of you are new to me. Blackwood and I go back, Jonathan Pajot and I go back a ways, but the rest of you, it's been remarkable, and remarkable to meet you here and at this table and in this manner. One of the things that starts to emerge, I've been in some writers' rooms, and what's fun is you start to understand personalities and perspectives of who's going to come with this kind of joke and who's going to unstick this kind of plot point. So it's very interesting, I notice as we evolve through the series, who I am looking to almost without, not consciously thinking of, like, well, Oz, I need to ask you something, and Douglas, there's something that I need you to weigh in on, or where I'm curious or looking for different commentaries. And so I think one of the things that's amazing is when there's a variety of perspectives here, as much as we're all joined in a common unity and rowing towards a common goal. There's a lot of variation in the ways that we see the world, and the ways that we find meaning, and the ways that we approach the text. And it's really compelling for me to see it depicted in so many ways. It's like, a nude descending a staircase, right? Exploded like a Rubik's Cube, right? Mm-hmm. There's all these perspectives into a different unified whole that we can kind of behold.
So we got a good Mount Sinai arrangement here, is that a reasonable amount of diversity within an encompassing unity. And that manifested itself in the integrity of the conversation.
Yeah, and I think we have about as much as we could take at this stage. Mm-hmm. We wouldn't want it to stretch even further yet.
Right.
And I'm thinking, of course, moving between different worlds, which I don't want to give names to or labels to, because we've had so much definitional collapse, I don't even know what names and things mean. But I move between different communities and different worlds freely and frequently, in which there's a lot of wisdom and resources and goodwill and genius. And in the back of my head, I'm always thinking about, if I could bring the best of all these different types of groups together, like the extent, if we could marry that we could be unstoppable as a people, as a country.
Well, that would be good if we could figure out how to make those voices that are noting the utility and necessity of the fringe together with the voices that are noting the utility of the unifying spirit.
That's right.
Right, and honest dialogue. This is one of the reasons I like talking to Russell Brand, for example.
Yeah.
Because he's
comedians are honest.
Yeah. Well, and he's a pretty good advocate of the fringe.
That's right.
And rightly so.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, and I keep thinking, of course, a lot of the ways that I think and move, part of why I move between so many communities is I really genuinely love people, and I love all different kinds of people. And I'm always thinking about the ways, a lot of my natural state when I'm navigating between different groups is to think about mediation and interpretation in some ways. And so I'm not armed. I have a more embodied understanding of so much from both the text and from all of you, and the ways that you all move in the world, to understand and to make connections that are sometimes difficult to forge through from one corner to another, and to see all the points of connection, and also to see a lot of the opportunities.
I think one of the advantages of walking through a really profound text is that it shows you how things are united, that look diverse, are united deeply underground, and then you can bring things together that you wouldn't be able to bring together without that. You're particularly good at that, by the way, Jonathan. So.
And you know, the what I'll now term the Pageauian fringe, that concept is that's
good
an
name.
amazing concept
You bet.
of the different kinds of monsters, right? We have the monsters of too muchness, right? Of sort of authoritarian deemed purity on the one hand, and then the explosive hybridization on the other, and the ways that those have to be navigated, and what's the center that we have to agree on, and what are the voices that bring different voices in and join at a table or a tabernacle or at a mountain. So that was very compelling to me also. And I would say, you know, Oz has talked a lot about, in the covenant, about freely chosen consent. I've thought about that a great deal since the last session, of that being sort of a baseline, not just for the political and not just for the religious, but for the personal, for every engagement in parenting, relationally, right? What are all the ways that I seek to exert some kind of control over something, an endeavor even, a relationship, parenting, right? Freely chosen consent as being a key unifying goal seems so essential.
Well, also, and maybe an indicator of the immanence of the transcendent, right? If you can structure the relationship so that you maximize the consent of the person you're in relationship with, that could easily be a marker that the proper spirit of dialogos exists in that relationship.
And there's such a clarity in Exodus. It's such clarity of the necessity for subservience to a higher order. And one of the things that I like so much in this is that the Israelites exhaust every other option that's available to them. They try and mess up every conceivable way, right? Redefining the past, lying about what they've just seen, right? Claiming glory for themselves. And it reminds me all the time, you know, those haunted house movies where you're like, why don't they just leave the house, right? and when you're working on a project like that, you're like, well, the phones are out because there's a storm and they can't reach the cops, right? And there's a flat tire, right? And somebody, you know, there's an angry staff member who savaged the road out, and you have to cover all the bases. And Exodus in some ways is a meticulous and exceptional covering of all the bases to any argument that you...
All the way a state can go wrong. A state and the people can go wrong.
All the ways you can try to not be subservient to a higher order in a way that's defined and uphold the world of your covenant, right? So you need to do that, and you can't just run out of the haunted house because no one's going to really care or believe it. So it proves its case with great wisdom and magnanimity. So
that's also what makes it a great work of literature, right? Because it's like when Dostoevsky writes Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov, the murderer, has every reason you can think of to be a murderer. Right? He goes right to the limits of the realm of possibility. And so, if the Passion story is an exploration of the limits of the tragedy of life, your point here is that Exodus is a archetypal examination of all the ways that a state and polity can go wrong.
Yes.
Right. Yeah,
and so that's
good.
that's an amazingly illuminated path, because you can't just lay out the story. Right, you have to lay out the avenues of all the other ways of why this is the illuminated path through this labyrinth of pharaohs and snakes and drowning seas and serpents and plagues and locusts. And so the other thing that I would say is that so much for me of my arrival or appreciation of faith is sort of the light of God shone on Michelangelo, right? Or the light of God shone through Beethoven. Like, it's very hard to listen to the Fourth or the Ninth and feel like that's something that he did, right? The light of God shone on Shakespeare. And so what's so interesting here is I think that one of the things that I've been giving a great deal of thought to about, let's just call it institutions, right? Even when we have a very clear separation, and in my estimation, clear and necessary separation to state and church, or that we have certain secular institutions that need to, or that precede that proceed at a distance from religion or faith, they can't function or flourish without the light of God shown on them or reflected to them. And so that was a very big part for me of this experience of walking through this with the wisdom of this collected cohort, is because it was another way to go back through Exodus, which I haven't read closely since my freshman year of high school, really, and to go through sort of piece by piece and see all the ways that this is a story that we use in some ways as in immersive experience, and also a mirror that you hold up and try to reflect and shine the light of onto every endeavor that we pursue.
Yeah, great. Douglas.
Well, thank you for the invitation to the feast. And if I may be forgiven for a possibly perverse image in a group where there are at least a couple of teetotalers, one might think about the strange phenomenon that a really good bottle of wine tastes in purely aesthetic terms better in company when you know that others are also enjoying the wine. And I felt it's been like this with this seminar, so thank you very much indeed. What have I taken from it? Well, this is obviously a paradigmatic narrative of pilgrimage. So clearly there's something compelling about that. And I've found it extraordinary to listen to the explication of that narrative on different levels, in terms of the explication of the Torah, or the psychological dimension, or the philosophical implications. So again, I've learned a great deal from that. And the symbolism, that has been, I'm looking at you, of course, Jonathan, among others, but the typological dimension. And I've been struck by I often think of the etymology of symbol, that the symbol is it's the sunbalein, it's the putting together. So symbol is somehow linked to unity. And interestingly, of course, the devil is the diabalein, the one tearing apart. Mm-hmm. Yeah? And of course, we all encounter that tearing apart of evil. So I think that sense of the symbolic unifying power of the text. And obviously I have a philosophical background, and I've long been troubled by the idea of, is this an arbitrary anthropomorphic deity that we're dealing with in the book of Exodus? And what really emerged for me, particularly in this session, or this part of the seminar, is the life-affirming dimension of the God who says, I am that I am. So this affirmation of life in the context, in the mirror of that great source of being that is the God of Exodus. So that celebration of life, I think that's something that came out very strongly for me from the discussions. And finally, I was very moved today by the discussion of the snake confronting the snakes. And in the context of these trigger warnings and the whole obsession with safety, I'm struck by the fact that in another part of the Mediterranean world, in the ancient Mediterranean world, the great theatre of Epidaurus is right next to the site of Asclepius. Now, isn't there something about the healing power of a imaginative tradition that is engaging with the human condition and with human suffering? And we've seen a great deal of suffering, a great deal of conflict, a great deal of failure in this text. As Greg was saying, the failures of the Israelites are egregious. And yet, what comes out of this text but this affirmation, this celebration of life?
This, at Athens, the great theater where the tragedies were held, is just outside the temple, just down the mountain. And so the Athenians had this temple that was associated with, really with this kind of pristine rationality, but right allied with that was the idea that the divine revelation was somehow deeply allied with the dramatic presentation of a sequence of tragedies. And so
I think originally it was in fact the amphitheatre itself was a site of worship. It was where the goat was sacrificed to Dionysus in the annual Dionysia. I think tragedy means, I think it means goat song, doesn't it?
Goat song, yep.
So it emerges out of this religious ritual, in effect.
It's also a good heavy metal band name.
Yeah.
Goat Song.
All right. Oz.
Thank you. What a privilege to be with you. This means a lot to me because these things first came up when I was a student in the 60s. I had just come to faith, and it was widely held that freedom and toleration came from the Enlightenment in revulsion to the wars of religion. So when I came across a better historical understanding that actually, through the Reformation and the rediscovery of Scripture, it was the Torah that had created the interest in the Hebrew Republic, and that was behind certainly the American experiment, but so much of the European interest in freedom. In other words, it struck me then, and it does today more deeply, Exodus should be put alongside Plato's Republic and Aristotle and Machiavelli's Prince and Burke and Montesquieu and people. It is a classic of understanding of humanity, freedom, and politics. And so as we've looked at this, the founding of God's nation, set over against Egypt and its techno-despotism, and Canaan and its earthy, unbridled sexual licentiousness, we're dealing with the same contrast we've got growing in our modern world. And so I've kept thinking of three things constantly in my mind as we've been discussing. One, we've got to stand with our Jewish friends against the appalling rise of anti-Semitism today. The debt we owe to the Jews is incredible and incalculable. Two, Americans should be ashamed if they don't understand this is the roots of their great experiment. They don't realize it. So people talk about Make America Great Again or restoring the soul, but they never say, what on earth made America great in the first place? And unless you understand Exodus, you don't understand it. But I go beyond that, and I think we're probably towards the end of the Western civilization. And the future, how is humanity going to create societies that are just and free with high human worth and so on? Here's all the ingredients, and we should be wrestling under the conditions of modernity with what this means. So a lot of that's been in the background of my mind as we've been discussing these things. So obviously, Exodus has three broad movements, very obviously. The Exodus, the covenant, and the presence of God among his people. But for me, the Exodus, many obvious lessons, a very simple one that people forget today. To be free, you have to be set free. We're not naturally free. The covenant, in other words, the way of living together freely, I love the idea, Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living. What the covenant says, the uninstructed life is not worth living. And I think for me, the reality of the presence of God, and of course, Exodus is so that they may know who I am, the Egyptians and the Israelites. I think today we've talked to secularism. Much of modernity is in Plato's cave. They haven't seen the sun. And what this is about at the end of the day is the need for a massive global awakening to the supernatural. And so we're dealing with things, I think, that are incredibly profound in themselves, as we've seen, but extraordinary significance
Well, this
for the world we're living in.
this idea that, I see this in the humanist atheists, that they make the presumption that the Enlightenment venture was the spirit of enlightened rationality against the dark superstitions of the medieval past and maybe the pre-medieval past. But there's a worship of a superstition there as well, and the worship of the superstition, as far as I can tell, is something like the temptations of a Luciferian rationalism. It's that there can be a purely intellectual and abstracted endeavor that will lead us to the light. And that in itself is a religious claim, and I do believe that it's the claim of the Luciferian intellect. And
Dr.
the
Faustus.
reason, yes, and the reason for that is that the attribution of the place of the omniscience necessary to guide us forward now becomes within, internal, but also it's allied with the rational mind. And I actually think that's part of the pride of the intellects.
Absolutely.
Because, around the table, we're all intellectuals, and I suspect we've all fallen prey to this temptation, is if you are an intellectual, if you are intelligent, let's say, and you're comfortable in this sphere of rational discourse and argumentation, it's easy to presume that that somehow elevates you among other people. And it's easy to presume that because that's worked so well for you and is the thing that maybe marks you out, is that should be placed on the highest pinnacle. And that's a very dangerous assumption. And it's an assumption that's just as metaphysical as the assumption that it's the God of Israel who's the proper guide through the desert, right? You're going to be under the sway of some spirit. And the Enlightenment rationalists hide that. They say, well, no, we have no God. It's like, yeah, Luciferian presumption is your God. And I really believe that's true. And I think that's the reason the French Revolution went so wrong. And, well, that's one of the reasons the French Revolution went so wrong. So there's no way out of abiding within a narrative. There's no way out of that. And I think the cognitive neuroscientists have become increasingly insistent on that point. And there's many fields of endeavor, intellectual fields of endeavor, that are pointing in exactly the same direction. So the story's the thing, right? And the question then becomes, what's the greatest story? What's the greatest story ever told? And certainly Exodus is in contention for that title. Stephen.
Gosh, it's there's so much to think about. What's really on my mind right now is thinking about the dynamic of this group, and I've been trying to think about the origins of that and how it's developed over these 16 seminars, which actually took place over 2 sessions, about 6 months apart. And I was thinking about how that came about and what the background is, and I remember, of course, many people know of this, but there was this. We were in Cambridge a few years ago, and we had a little chat with Douglas and Roger Scruton, as you'll recall, and it was your first time in Cambridge, and we were walking around, and you were just, wow, what a beautiful place. And I remember you said, do you think there's any chance I could come back here? And not that it was up to me, I was just a visitor like you, but Douglas invited you back to Cambridge to a fellowship, which was then canceled, and it was very sad. I found it very sad because your enthusiasm and joy, your delight at the thought that you might be able to have conversations with Douglas and his colleagues and others at the University of Cambridge, James.
About Exodus.
In fact, it was meant to be about Exodus. And it was so sad to see that just dashed. And it was sad for me personally to see it for you, but it was sad to think about what that would what might not happen. And then it was not long after that you and your family had a very difficult time, and I know you've talked about this publicly, a long period of a kind of desert and illness and
some tyranny in there,
and some tyranny in there too. And it was one point in the sort of middle end of that you and I had a chat on Zoom, and I could tell that you were really struggling, and you've given so much to so many people, opened things up for them, and I felt really saddened. It's difficult to see someone suffer, let alone someone you love and admire. And I remember just thinking, is there anything I could give to Jordan? I mean, I don't live close enough. I can't go over and, I don't know, cook him a steak. I mean, we live too far away, and I had a few years earlier an experience during a Lent where a few friends, we had just gathered, actually, this was before Zoom, we were on the old thing called the telephone, and once a week we talked our way through the Odyssey with someone who knew a lot about it, and it was just a wonderful revelatory conversation, and it was sort of reflecting on our own lives and own spiritual lives in relation to this great text. And so I remember writing to you, I don't know, September or whatever month it was, sort of the end of that summer, saying, would you like to try and have a conversation about, maybe some text? We could just choose something, And you, with the kind of amazing stroke, said, well, maybe that could be, maybe Exodus. We could talk about Exodus. That would be preparation for my lectures.
I remember that.
And then it could have, fell by the wayside, because actually then you really were feeling much better, and you started traveling again, and the tour and so long. But you didn't lose the idea, and that's not. It's not the point of the story. Is not in the least that I feel somehow to take credit for this conversation. It's actually that, for me, those origins are very important to what's happening here. Origins of a kind of friendship. And my biggest reflection about our time together is how much deeper I feel this conversation has become for me. And one thing our listeners may not know is that, in addition to the long period of time we've spent in this conversation, I've been joking, it was kind of about as long as the Israelites were in the desert. It was like a real-time length, but is that we've actually spent a lot of time outside of being on the camera, and not just kind of getting ready to come into the studio, but social time where we've talked and
jet skiing.
We've had a lot of fun, for sure. And to me, this is really what we've talked about our lives. Certainly we've gotten to know each other better. We've shared things about our personal lives and things that we're dealing with, you might say, and talked a lot about exciting intellectual things. And my sense is that as we've done that, we've gotten to know each other better, and also come to trust each other more deeply. And knowledge and trust are very closely related. And my own feeling is that deepening trust, in a sense, is also what enabled us to approach the text more and more deeply as we went into it, because we kind of knew that we knew something deeper about each other that enabled us to find something and help each other see something deeper in the text. And it seems to me that this is really profound, the fundamental sort of human truth that you both require friendship to seek high things, but it's also the result of that seeking, is that friendship becomes deepened by that. Absolutely. And people talk all the time, there's this big mess in our kind of civic life, and social media is a big part of it, but it's not the only part of this kind of alienation. And people think as if in the midst of that alienation, you can somehow then talk about the most controversial thing that you would most disagree with. That's nonsense. There is no such thing as having an impossible conversation with someone you don't trust. If you want to go deep into something, you've got to have a place and a way of doing that with others.
Well, do you think that's any different than that establishment of a relationship with the vertical and the horizontal simultaneously?
No, I don't.
It seems like a recreation of the Mount Sinai ideal.
I think that's exactly right. And in some sense, I suppose, what I want to say to our listeners is what I think I want to say, what I've reflected on in ourselves, and that is, if you want to discover deeper things and go deeper, then there's a sense in which you can begin by lifting others up in a way, to sharing yourself with others in a way that allows you to create that horizontal, or that is itself, when you do that with others, you're already orienting yourself to something high, which is why it gives that horizontal life, that horizontal movement depth and power and truth.
It makes it foundational rather than sprawling.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, for that, I thank you all, and especially you, Jordan Peterson.
Great, Stephen. All right, Mr. Peugeot, looks like
Can I
you
say
have
something after that? I'm about to cry.
You have
That's going to happen.
You have the final word here, sir.
I have to say that the whole time we've been doing this, we've been going through this. One of the things, the thought that has come up and in the discussion is just how impossible what it is that we're doing. You know, how can we be talking 16 hours about a book, and how is it that all these people want to watch it, and how is it that we're doing it in a spirit of curiosity and of helping each other and of moving towards this unity. And I think that in some ways what I'm seeing happening now, this weird thing that we've been through, is a concentration of something that started, at least for me, started when I encountered you several years ago. What I've seen is that there's a shift happening in culture. It's happening right now. And it's making things that were completely impossible before all of a sudden possible. You know, the fact that we notice that we're seeing the kind of just arrogant secular atheism recede in the popular perception. I thought that, I prayed for that to be possible, but I didn't see it as something that was going to imminently happen. The fact of watching young people in their 20s suddenly want to read this book, suddenly want to go to church, suddenly want to read the great books, and just, once again, it's something that I prayed and hoped that would happen, but I didn't expect it to in some ways. And ultimately, I would say, you know, when I was in college, I realized that we had a problem. And one of the problems was, on the one hand, you had Bible scholars who argued about some little name in the text and where did it come from and who was the author, and fighting over all this stuff, breaking down the story and the narrative. And on the other hand, I could see groups and churches trying to hold the narrative for themselves and make it useful only to their purpose. And what I dreamt of and I hoped for was the possibility of looking at this story of this text as something which is foundational for our very perception of reality, for the very way in which we, you know, and being able to look at the narrative and eschewing those two problems. And we did it, and it's astounding. And I'm just completely amazed and grateful, honestly, to God, but then also grateful to you and to Daily Wire for making something that seemed completely unreasonable happen. And so, thank you.
All right, everyone watching and listening, that's exactly 1 hour, so isn't that just lovely? And thank you for all your concluding thoughts, and thank you to all of you who are watching and listening for your unexpected and very welcome time and attention. I hope that it serves you well, as it served us. To the Daily Wire Plus folks for making this possible and doing it so professionally, setting up this beautiful set and being on the ball technologically, being generous with the consequence, being generous with the resources. To all of those who've helped create the spirit of hospitality that has surrounded our venture, to all of you attending and participating, and to Larry Arnn and Ben Shapiro, who aren't here today, for not being the bloody stars of the show, but letting the whole enterprise carry on underneath its own impetus and letting the text be the star. That's a hell of a thing to see, and it's really something great, and it's been a privilege for me to be a part of this. And so, on to the next book, gentlemen. Thank you very much, everyone.